The last time someone asked you what you do or who you are, you answered without thinking. A few words tossed out like small talk. Those words are still working on you right now, hours or days later, rearranging how you make decisions. And the version of yourself you described in that sentence is the version your brain is quietly building toward. There's a study from the 60s that most people have heard a distorted version of. Researchers gave elementary school students an IQ test, then told teachers that certain kids were about to experience a dramatic intellectual bloom. The catch: those kids were chosen at random. 8 months later, the randomly selected children actually scored higher on IQ retests. The teacher's expectations had seeped into tone, eye contact, patience, challenge level. The kids absorbed a description of themselves they'd never even heard directly, and their cognition bent to match it. Now scale that effect inward. You are your own most attentive teacher. You hear every description you give of yourself. Every single one. When you tell a coworker, "I'm terrible with names," something specific happens inside your skull. Memory systems that handle name-face associations receive less metabolic priority. Your brain is an efficiency machine. It hears the executive summary, bad at names, and reallocates resources accordingly. Why burn energy encoding a name if the person running this operation has already declared the project a failure? This is measurable. Researchers studying self-referential processing have shown that statements beginning with "I am" activate a specific midline brain network associated with identity consolidation, the same network that fires when you recall core memories or imagine your future self. Casual self-descriptions ride the same neural highway as your deepest beliefs about who you are. So when you say "I'm not a math person," you're issuing an architectural directive. The language you use matters down to the grammar. A team at Stanford gave voters 2 framings before an election. One group read, "How important is it to you to be a voter?" The other read, "How important is it to you to vote?" A single word changed, noun versus verb. The group that received the noun framing, voter, an identity label, showed a measurably higher turnout. The noun made it personal. The verb made it optional. Voting was something you could skip. Being a voter was something you'd betray by staying home. Your self-descriptions work the same way, running in reverse all day long. "I'm a runner" carries different weight than "I run sometimes." "I'm a writer" reorganizes your Tuesday evening differently than "I like to write." The noun version plants a flag in identity territory. Skip the run, and you feel friction, because now the absence conflicts with who you declared yourself to be. This is where it gets dangerous in a direction most people miss. The effect works identically for negative labels. "I'm an anxious person," "I'm lazy," "I'm bad with money." These declarations function as load-bearing walls in your self-concept, and the longer they stand, the more your daily behavior leans against them for support. A therapist would recognize this mechanism instantly. One of the most effective clinical techniques for disrupting chronic patterns involves something almost embarrassingly simple: changing the language a person uses to narrate their own experience. Shifting from "I am anxious" to "I'm experiencing anxiety right now" sounds like a semantic parlor trick. The clinical outcomes say otherwise. The first framing welds the emotion to identity. The second treats it as weather, something passing through, observed from a stable position. That distinction between "I am" and "I am experiencing" maps onto something researchers call self-distancing. When you linguistically separate yourself from a state, your capacity to regulate that state jumps. People who narrate stressful events using their own name instead of "I" show reduced emotional reactivity on physiological measures. The verbal frame changes the felt distance, and distance is where choice lives. Think about the last time you introduced yourself at a social gathering. The words you reached for probably felt automatic, like pulling a file from a drawer. "I'm a software developer." "I'm a stay-at-home mom." "I'm kind of a homebody." You've said these phrases so many times they feel like reporting facts. They feel like mirrors. They're blueprints. Every repetition strengthens the association. The phrase "I'm not creative" doesn't describe a fixed trait. It's a rehearsal that makes the trait more fixed with each performance. You're running a drill, and your brain, which cannot distinguish between a label you chose carefully and one you tossed out at a dinner party, encodes both with equal seriousness. This mechanism explains why people who survive major life disruptions A move to a new country, a career collapse, a divorce sometimes describe the aftermath as a strange liberation. The disruption shattered their rehearsed self-descriptions. Suddenly, the scripts don't apply. I'm a banker doesn't work when the bank let you go. We're the couple who hosts Thanksgiving doesn't survive a separation. In that disorienting gap between old labels and new ones, something opens up. The identity is temporarily unclaimed, and for a window, you get to write fresh descriptions without the gravitational pull of 1,000 prior repetitions. Most people rush to close that gap. The discomfort of an unlabeled self is severe. It triggers the same neural alarm systems as physical threat. So they grab the nearest available label, often one that's worse than what they lost. I'm damaged. I'm starting over. I'm behind. And those emergency labels start building their own architecture before the dust has settled. The people who navigate these transitions well tend to do one thing differently. They describe themselves in terms of direction rather than position. I'm figuring out what I want instead of I'm lost. I'm building something new instead of I'm starting from scratch. The directional frame preserves momentum. The positional frame assigns a location, and locations feel permanent. There's a version of this you've lived through without noticing. You've watched a friend go through a breakup, and slowly over weeks start using different words. At first they say, I'm heartbroken. Then, I'm healing. Then, months later, I'm someone who knows what they want now. You witnessed a self-concept being rebuilt in real time through nothing more than shifted language. Each new phrase was a small act of construction. The oldest traditions understood this on an intuitive level. Naming ceremonies across cultures treat the assignment of a name as the moment identity begins. In several indigenous traditions, receiving a new name at a life transition marks the death of oneself and the birth of another. The idea that words spoken aloud have constructive power isn't modern psychology dressed in spiritual clothing. The modern psychology is ancient intuition finally reaching a laboratory. So what happens when you take this seriously? The shift is smaller than you'd expect. You start catching yourself mid-sentence. I'm terrible at, and you pause. You notice the architectural directive about to land. You rephrase. Maybe you say something less absolute. Maybe you describe a behavior instead of an identity. I haven't practiced that skill much. Same information, completely different instruction set for your brain. Over weeks, the accumulated effect of these micro-edits starts to compound. Each revised self-description is a vote cast in a different direction, and the identity system, which operates on majority rule, begins updating its model. The lag time is real. You'll feel like a fraud for a while, describing yourself in terms that don't match your current self-concept. That discomfort is the signal that the old architecture is load-bearing. You're renovating a building you're still living in. Critics of this idea argue that language change without behavioral change is just positive thinking in a lab coat. And they have a point. The words alone don't rewire the system. The words change the threshold for action. I'm a runner makes it slightly easier to put on the shoes. The shoes make the run happen. The run reinforces the label. A feedback loop that started with a sentence. You are, right now, the accumulated output of every self-description you've repeated enough times to become load-bearing. Some of those descriptions were chosen. Most were inherited from a moment of frustration, a passing comment from a parent, a joke you made at your own expense that got a laugh and so you kept it in the rotation. Every sentence you speak about yourself is a building permit. The question worth sitting with tonight is simple. What exactly are you building?